Here's a pretty wild idea. What if how you eat your lunch could say more about your true character than your entire resume? It's this thought that our smallest, most unconscious daily habits, well, they might just be broadcasting the truth about who we really are. So in this explainer, we're going to dig in and see if there's any truth to that. We all do it, right? We're constantly trying to solve the puzzle of other people. And let's be honest, people are masters of self-presentation. We build these polished, public versions of ourselves. But how do you actually get a peek behind that curtain? How do you see someone's internal operating system? The code that really dictates their discipline and reliability when nobody's watching. Well, a really fascinating book called Watch How They Eat puts forward this radical idea. Forget the grand gestures, forget what people say. It argues that the real clues to a person's character are hidden in plain sight, in the thousands of tiny decisions we make every single day, especially around something as basic as food. Okay, so let's try to unmask some of these hidden signals. The core idea is actually pretty simple. While anyone can fake a confident smile for a few hours, it's nearly impossible to fake the thousands of automatic routines that make up your day-to-day life. And those patterns of behavior, they tell a much, much more honest story about who you really are. The book really hangs its entire argument on what it calls the self-treatment principle. And the idea is this: the most reliable predictor of how someone will handle their responsibilities, their job, their promises, even their relationships, is how they handle themselves. It all starts with self-governance. So, how do we actually read these patterns? Well, the book's framework breaks it down into a few key signals. We're going to focus on two of the most revealing ones, what it calls the discipline signal and the awareness signal. First up, the discipline signal. Now, this isn't about being rigid or restrictive. It's more about the quiet, internal ability to manage those short-term impulses for the sake of what you want long-term. The book's whole argument is that our eating habits are basically a constant, daily training ground for this exact skill. And this discipline, it shows up in these small, almost invisible choices. Things like consistently choosing water over a soda, or stopping when you're satisfied, not just because the plate is empty, or actually making time for a calm meal instead of just grabbing whatever and rushing through it. Every single one of those actions is like a tiny vote you're casting for either immediate gratification or your long-term goals. All right, the second key signal is awareness. This one is all about the difference between living on autopilot and actually living with presence. It really asks a simple question. Is this person experiencing their life, or are they just trying to get through it? And a meal is the perfect little laboratory to see the answer play out. We all know this picture, right? The person eating while scrolling on their phone, barely even tasting their food. The book argues that this pattern of distracted eating, it's not trivial. It can be a signal of a mind that's constantly being pulled somewhere else, that's unable to just be present. On the flip side, someone who intentionally carves out space for a meal, well, that demonstrates a much more grounded, focused approach to life. Okay, so this is a really compelling framework. It sounds good, it makes sense, but is it just a theory, or is there some hard science to actually back this up? Let's take a quick look at the research. And what's amazing is that neuroscience largely agrees with this idea. See, our brain has a control center called the prefrontal cortex. You can just think of it as the brain's CEO. One part of the CEO is in charge of executive control, giving you the power to say no to that tempting cookie. Another part acts like the strategist, weighing the long-term value of your health goals against that immediate pleasure. It's in this constant negotiation with the brain's reward system. So discipline isn't just some vague virtue. It's a measurable function of how well your brain's CEO is doing its job. And the reason these signals become so stable is all because of how our brains form habits. Our brains are built for efficiency. So when we repeat an action, like say grabbing a snack every time we walk by the pantry, it gets hardwired into a habit loop. The brain's CEO basically offloads that task to the autopilot part of the brain. And that's how our actions become second nature, for better or for worse. But, of course, it's not that simple. Nothing ever is, right? To get the full picture, we have to look at the powerful forces that shape these habits from the outside in. This is the reality check. So here's a crucial reality check. Willpower is not limitless. Scientists call this concept ego depletion. The best way to think of it is like a muscle. If you spend all day long using that self-control muscle to make tough decisions at work, by the time you get home, that muscle is tired. It's exhausted. And that's why it's so much harder to resist that late-night snack. It isn't a moral failure. It's just a biological reality. And that willpower muscle, it gets tired even faster when you're under pressure. We can't just talk about internal discipline without acknowledging all the powerful external stuff. Things like financial stress, a crazy demanding job, or even just living in a neighborhood that's basically a sea of fast food signs. All of these things put a constant tax on our willpower, making self-control exponentially harder. And then there's the incredible power of our social networks. The data from the famous Framingham Heart Study it's just stunning. It found that if a close friend of yours becomes obese, your own risk increases by a staggering 57%. But get this, it doesn't even stop there. Your risk also goes up if your friend's friend does, and even if your friend's friend's friend does. Our habits, it turns out, are socially contagious. They literally spread through our networks like a virus. So, what do we do with all this? On one hand, you have this really powerful idea about reading these character signals. On the other hand, you have the complex reality of our biology and our environment. Let's try to pull all this together into a framework we can actually use. The smart way to look at this is to synthesize these two perspectives. We can take the core insight from Watch How They Eat and then layer it with all the nuance from the scientific research. And this leads us to a much more balanced conclusion. Yes, the signals are real. They do tell us something important about a person's capacity for self-governance. But, and this is a big but, context is everything. And that leads us to probably the most important takeaway of all. When we observe these habits in someone else, or even in ourselves, we're not looking at a final judgment of their moral worth. We're just seeing a snapshot, an indicator of their current capacity to manage themselves within their given circumstances. It's a measure of their available resources, not the content of their character. You know, in the end, this whole framework is most powerful not as a tool for judging other people, but as a mirror for ourselves. The real value comes from turning that observational lens inward. When we start to decode our own patterns, that's when we gain the self-awareness that is the first and, honestly, the most critical step toward any kind of growth. So I'll just leave you with this question. There's a lot of research on something called narrative identity, which says we build our sense of self by the stories we tell. And our daily habits, well, they're basically writing that story, day by day, action by action. So take a look at your own habits. What story are they telling about you?